had rediscovered the ideas of Plato and other philosophers. Macedonio Fernandez wrote little, read little, but thought much, and conversed brilliantly. He became, for Borges, the incarnation of pure thought, a man who attempted to solve metaphysical questions about time and existence, dreams and reality, which Borges would then make his, book after book, contriving a new literature, a new way of writing and reading.
Language is an artificial system which has nothing to do with reality. Reality is a combination of perceptions, emotions, feelings, distractions, dreams and surprises. That is reality. Language, on the other hand, is a rigid system with different rules we must obey. We use nouns to call things by names we have invented. An example of this would be an apple. We call that fruit an apple, but we can only perceive its color, taste, shape, texture, weight in your hand. But we don't really know if there is something called an apple. So any language is an artificial system compared with reality.
Borges was swept away by the creative fever of Buenos Aires. In Spain, where the family had stopped after Geneva, Borges had met other poets who called themselves the ultraists and believed the metaphor to be the very essence of poetry. Embracing the movement, Borges, back in Buenos Aires, took part in a series of magazines, Proa, Prisma, Destiempo and Critica. In 1931, Borges met a young man 17 years his junior, Adolfo Bioy Casares. They eventually collaborated on a series of hilarious stories and satirical essays under the pen name of Bustos Domecq. Bioy taught me simplicity and clarity, Borges would say later.
Sometimes, when Jorge came home from his great friend, Bioy Casares, with whom he used to write, he had dinner with him every evening and would come home around 11:30, midnight, sometimes later, and he would ask me, "Are you tired?" "No, I'm not tired," I would reply. And I would give him his glass of cold milk, and everyone went to bed.
One of my uncles, Miguel Casares, tried to help my career as a writer. He asked me to write a semi-commercial, semi-scientific pamphlet about yogurt. I was to be paid 16 pesos per page. At that time, Borges was struggling financially, so I asked him to help me. We went to my father's house in Pardo, Las Flores, to write there. As this was such a boring project, we fantasized about one day writing short stories and novels together. Time passed until one day I asked him, "Don't you think the day has arrived for us to start writing together?" And that's how our collaboration started. It was a very good thing to do, because we learnt a lesson of humility. When you're a writer, you think you're good enough to write about anything you want, all alone. But then Borges and I experienced the same problem. Writing alone, we used to feel helpless. But when we wrote together, our difficulties were overcome together.
Borges and Bioy had been introduced by Victoria Ocampo, Grande Dame of Argentinian letters. Ocampo was a rich and intelligent society belle, a true cosmopolitan who attempted to open Argentinian culture to the world and bring the world to Argentina. She succeeded through her magazine Sur, which she founded in 1931, and in which Borges was to publish many of his masterpieces: Discussion, Universal History of Infamy, History of Eternity, and other inquisitions. Essays which in fact are short stories which in turn are essays. These texts, like those he published elsewhere, were gathered into books under the imprint of Sur. Sur allowed him a further opportunity to write about an art form which becomes for him a catalogue of reality, the cinema.
It's not surprising that in one of the first articles that he published in Sur in the 20s, he talked about the idea that cinema reveals an infinite catalogue of human behavior. It was the only way to see how other people in other parts of the world would behave, and for him, the only way to learn about things that were impossible to experiment. For example, the films from von Sternberg were his favorites. But the ones starring Marlene Dietrich with a strong dose of eroticism stopped interesting him, probably because Borges shied away from using eroticism in his work. It wasn't professional criticism. It was done in the way a writer writes about things that stimulate his imagination.
On February the 24th, 1938, Borges received a call from his mother that his father was dying. The death of Jorge Borges left his son entirely in charge of the financial support of the family. A year earlier, Borges had begun working in a small municipal library, Miguel Cane. He was very unhappy among bored and bureaucratic employees with no real interest in the books that surrounded them. Only the reading of Dante during his long ride to and from work offered him some consolation during those years. He also read Chinese literature, the short stories of Chesterton, novels by Aldous Huxley and Julian Green. He favoured especially detective novels. 1938 was also the year in which Borges suffered an accident that almost cost him his life and that he recounted in his short story, The South.
He didn't wait for the lift and ran hurriedly up the stairs. Something in the darkness brushed his forehead. A bat? A bird? On the face of the woman who opened the door for him, he saw a look of horror, and the hand he passed across his forehead was now red with blood. The edge of a freshly painted window that someone had forgotten to close had caused the wound. He managed to sleep, but at dawn he was awake, and from then onwards the taste of all things was terrible. Fever wasted him, and the illustrations of the 1001 Nights served to furnish his nightmares. Friends and relatives visited him, and with an exaggerated smile assured him that he looked very well. He heard them with mild astonishment, and he was amazed that they didn't realize he was in hell.
I underwent an operation. I feared that I had lost my mental ability. So I told myself, if I write a little critique, an article, and can't do it, then it will mean the end of me. If I try to pen a poem, it won't mean anything because poetry does not depend